Masvidal and.
But that's interesting, isn't it? It's the characters that draw you to it. So the sport itself is interesting, but if these guys didn't talk and if there weren't storylines attached to the fights, you probably wouldn't be that interested. And I think what they've done better than any other promotion is they've understood the power of the narrative. So to take an example of a recent pay-per-view, you had Jorge Masvidal against Colby Covington. He's not Irish. Colby Covington. And these guys used to be roommates. They used to be best friends. They used to train together, live together. A few things happened. They fell out, and now they can't stand each other. And they really, really played on that to sell pay-per-view.
And everybody was kung fu fighting. Those cats were fast as lightning. I must admit it was a little bit frightening. I don't know the next one.
So, how does that tie into the topic of the day then?
It's about UFC, baby. UFC. UFC, but I mean, we all know what the UFC is, yeah, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and it's the top of all the MMA mixed martial arts. What would you say?
Promotions.
Promotions. Yeah, mixed martial arts promotion, and it's kind of the real dominant one if you compare to boxing. I feel like I want to compare to boxing a lot during this conversation, but it's I just wanted to talk about how dominant it is and what its rise and why we all find it interesting. It seems to draw people in, doesn't it? I don't know. Anyone else wants a quick piece? If we
No, I like it as well. It's a great show. So,
I guess why do you think that is? Why do you think out of all of them, UFC's risen to the top? Because
I believe it was the first sort of international promotion.
So maybe we should start in the beginning, like for somebody who has no idea about martial arts or anything whatsoever about these kind of events, what they do. What it's about.
So the UFC, as Den said, is the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and it only started just under 30 years ago. I think it was 1993 was UFC 1. And what is UFC? Well, UFC is a promotion which organizes events of mixed martial arts fights. So a typical pay-per-view event. So they have about one pay-per-view event per month on average. And you might have, you have fights on the prelims, and then you have fights on the main card, and usually, not always, but usually there's a title fight or two title fights to end the evening. So it's actually relatively young. It's younger than all three of us. So it was, I think 1993 was the first one. It was actually really interesting at the start because what they had was something to find the Ultimate Fighting Champion, which is where the name the UFC came from. Mm-hmm. And athletes would come with only one skill set. So think about mixed martial arts as it is today. Well, you have kids growing up learning wrestling, learning jiu-jitsu, learning judo, learning striking, so boxing and kickboxing, and developing these skills throughout their childhood. In the early days, it wasn't like this at all. So you take if you YouTube UFC 1, it's fantastic because there were no weight classes, no gloves. Some people were wearing shoes, some people weren't. Depends what sport they came from. But you'd get pure athletes in their chosen martial art, and you just sort of pit these athletes against each other. So it's like when people have these hypothetical arguments about if two animals fought, who would come out on top? Like if a dog fought a bear, who would come out on top? If a bear fought a lion, who would come out on top? It was like this with human beings. So you'd have a judoka from judo versus a boxer. So the boxer would come out with his gloves, and the judoka would try and do his thing. The boxer would try and do his thing, and you sort of match these skill sets together. So it was not just athlete against athlete in the early days. It was very much martial art versus martial art, and you had these champions representing their martial art, and it was a fascinating experiment. And actually, I mean, this is a kind of a side road that we won't go all the way down, but interestingly enough, that's where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became world famous.
Okay.
Because the first few, I can't remember, I think it was the first three out of the first 5 or 4 out of the first 5 UFC competitions was won by a jiu-jitsu player. So he beat the boxers, he beat the wrestlers, he beat every single other martial art, and made it look quite easy. It was Royce Gracie, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And the whole thing was televised, so somebody could look it up, or?
Oh yeah, it's all on YouTube. It's incredible if you compare the events they stage now to the early ones. Because like I say, there were pretty much no rules except I think it was no biting and no gouging.
And I suppose they've whittled it down now and made rules so that it's kind of a more. I don't know. Why would they do that? So it's a more respected sport, or they've just found that to keep it competitive, maybe that there's certain rules, or I don't know. I wonder how that.
No, it's a good question actually. I think
how that came around. Why they cut out and made it more, because it's a lot. There's a lot of rules nowadays, and you wonder how they all came about. Yeah.
I mean, there weren't even weight classes before, so there weren't any divisions. It was just one Ultimate Fighting champion. So Royce Gracie was actually one of the lighter guys. He'd be going up against people much heavier than he was. But now they've got weight classes. There's a women's division, a men's division. I think they made rules to make it actually a respected sport worldwide. Because
maybe to be commissioned in more areas as well,
right.
Which is something that you hear Dana White talk about a lot, don't you?
Right, because a few years ago it was still illegal in states like New York, for example, because in the early days and up until relatively recently, it was seen as kind of human cockfighting. You know, as kind of this savagery, because they fight in a cage. I mean, it sounds dramatic, but it's an 8-sided ring, but the walls are about 2 meters high, sort of with this what do you call it? Like what's that material then?
Mesh.
The mesh. There we go. Yeah, the sort of iron mesh around it. So it to be locked in a cage and fighting like that is it doesn't seem family friendly, but they've tried to popularize it, I think, by taking the brutal edge off it, even if people do get seriously hurt doing it.
Yeah, and I guess that must have had a big factor in what it's become nowadays is quite, not even in a boring way, regulated. It's still mixed martial arts, but
I guess it's just a commercial decision to get it as spread out as possible. And if, like you said, there were certain regulations in certain states and countries, then I suppose that they had to abide by certain, they had to adapt their laws and their rules to be able to perform
maybe to become more respected. Because I don't know, I guess you'd think that your basic mind would think that you just want to see the toughest guy fight the toughest guy in 2 different sports, but maybe you don't. There's no story to follow there, and maybe someone's too dominant and things like that. So,
but the interesting thing about it now is that you need to be competent in every single martial art. You have to be competent in judo. You have to be competent in jiu-jitsu. You have to be competent in striking, but you have to be extraordinary at least one of them in order to be a champion. I'm talking about, or even to make it to the UFC. To be honest, because the standard is getting higher and higher.
Right.
But if you're a world champion wrestler and you don't know any jiu-jitsu, then if somebody takes you down and starts working jiu-jitsu on you, you're going to lose straight away. And the same is true for a jiu-jitsu player who has no striking skills. He's going to get knocked out in the first minute. So it's an incredible thing. I was listening to this podcast of this guy who's the the sports science vice president at the UFC Institute, the Performance Institute, in Las Vegas, because all of the athletes now have access to this high-tech sports science facility, and he was talking about the kinds of things they do there, and he said it's we say that MMA is 90% mental except the 60% that's physical. That's the little joke, because it adds up to more than 100. But he's basically said it's
Obviously, there's my abacus thing, yeah.
Yeah. It's all encompassing, you know. It really does take every single aspect of you as an individual, physical, psychological, and put it to its limits in a very tough environment. And Joe Rogan, what does Joe Rogan call it? High level problem solving with dire physical consequences.
I love that line.
Yeah.
He thinks it's so clever, doesn't he?
I think that's one he repeats a lot, isn't it? But I've also it's kind of human chess at the same time, because if Sal comes with certain skill sets, I need to be able to nullify his skill sets and impose my strengths, and it's all about how our strengths and weaknesses match up on any given evening, and working out this puzzle. There's another way I've heard it described. It's a puzzle that's moving very, very, very quickly. Kind of like, you know, jiu-jitsu is the same thing, but the point here is that we have so many more possible moves and so many more possible scenarios because of all of the martial arts that are open in this rule set. So it is really, really fascinating, actually.
So I'm going to ask a question, and it might take this conversation in a way that we shouldn't really make it go too early. But how did you get into UFC, James? What drew? Because like I say, what I'm interested in is why it's the most popular one. You've got Bellator and everything. And another question I'm interested in is why, you know, people moan about the wrestling. I don't see why it's bigger than Muay Thai or kickboxing championships. So there must be something to do with the promotion there, as opposed to just the actual sport itself. Does that make sense? But anyway, let me ask you the question. The main question is, how did you get into it, James, and then Sal? How did you get into the UFC? What drew you to it?
Well, I started doing jiu-jitsu when I was 28, and I got really good at that. And then I started boxing. So I got a call from Las Vegas, and they asked me if... No.
I was thinking, this isn't the time. I don't want to be saying off, but this isn't the time. Man. You didn't do jiu-jitsu first. You're into UFC first.
How did I get into the UFC? I think, I was thinking about this earlier, I think the first person who interested me in the UFC was Conor McGregor.
Yeah.
And that wasn't because I knew anything about...
That was a dangerous angle in the conversation. I didn't want to do that, because there's a whole other 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Go,
20 minutes. But
you can't talk
it
UFC
wasn't
without talking match. Yeah.
It wasn't about MMA at that point, or the sport. It was about his ability to talk, his communication skills, his presentation skills, whatever you want to call it. I was fascinated by him as a communicator, the way that he used his words to promote fights, to make people excited about fights, but also to destroy his opponents, like psychologically destroy his opponents. And he had many, many great lines. "We're not here to take part, we're here to take over." That's a very terrible Irish accent. But I think from what I remember, because he wasn't the first big UFC star. Obviously, before that he had Anderson Silva, and then going back, you know, George St. Pierre and many other legends. But arguably, he was the first person who captured, you know, the layperson's attention, and I would consider myself a layperson of mixed martial arts because of the way that he spoke, because of this electrifying charisma that he had. Electrifying. How about you, Sal? Are you into the UFC? We're assuming.
Yeah, you assume quite a lot here. I must admit, I'm not really into the UFC. That's why I'm actually very happy that we're doing this today, because I'm learning maybe something about it. You know, I've been watching a few clips here and there. Also, certainly some Conor McGregor clips, because he's quite the entertainer. And also every now and then in the news cycle, when there was some kind of a scandal, I was, checking up on him. I guess I started watching it a bit more often, and I think I maybe have watched a few entire fights since I started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Because then actually I started also to recognize some of the moves when they applied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and so I was looking for information. and for inspiration, I would say. And then, as you also mentioned before, some guests who were on podcasts who were talking about their fights. I got curious about them and just wanted to see what they did in their career. And so I looked a little bit into the UFC world. But I'm not really a huge fan or follower or anything. But if there's a good fight with highly acclimated fighters that's being promoted, and I hear you guys talk about it, and I hear other people talk about it, and I'm like, maybe I should check out what's going on.
Maybe that's the answer to Den's second question.
The promotion.
It's about the hype, and why would it reach somebody like you, Sal, who's sort of semi-interested, but on the peripheries of the sport? It reaches you through.
I'd argue a big part of it probably for us three is Joe Rogan as well, because we're all Joe Rogan guys for other reasons, and then he's obviously a UFC commentator, and they talk about that, comes up a lot during his podcast. So maybe the Joe Rogan thing has a big effect on promoting the UFC. I wonder how much he doesn't let on that, but you wonder how much, Dana White and everyone appreciates that. And I don't know what part of Joe Rogan's fame comes from being UFC or vice versa now, because he's just gone into the stratosphere, isn't he? Maybe it's a kind of rising tide raising all ships scenario, but at one point, UFC was bigger than Joe Rogan, and now I feel like Joe Rogan's bigger than UFC, and
I don't
know. Probably carried the sport.
What about you then? How did you become familiar with it?
Yeah, the same, man. Big Conor McGregor, and I remember when we did the Seville Marathon. I think we didn't know we were both McGregor fans, and
2016.
It came out. I think we both said, "Oh yeah, I'll follow Conor." It's funny enough. I remember I was at a party one time, and this guy was telling me, "Oh, you heard of Conor McGregor?" I said, "No, who's that?" He said, "Man, you've got to check him out. He's brilliant. The way he talks, everything." And I just didn't know or care or anything. And then I must have just come across a few clips of him, and like you say, it's just electric the way he spoke, and it was must have been before the Nate Diaz fight, because I remember
that's right,
being really drunk and waking up on a Sunday and looking at my phone, and he'd lost, and I was like, "How did he look?" He lost, and then I realised I think he'd lost already in the UFC, hadn't he? But at the time, he was just next level.
Not in the UFC.
I think he might have lost. Oh, was it?
I think he lost in another promotion. Yeah, that would tie up then, because the Seville Marathon for us was February 2016, and his fight with Nate Diaz I think was March, April 2016, and then the rematch was in August.
Diaz 2 hype. I remember watching that was huge. We were away together.
That was huge.
So it was definitely the McGregor thing that got me into it, and it's I'll say it with a bit of a. I kind of scoff when I say it, but like you say, I'm a casual like the rest of us here. So I wasn't into it before, and it was I was probably more. But then I like it now. I'm into all the guys in there, like, Israel Adesanya, Masvidal,
But that's interesting, isn't it? It's the characters that draw you to it. So the sport itself is interesting, but if these guys didn't talk and if there weren't storylines attached to the fights, you probably wouldn't be that interested. And I think what they've done better than any other promotion is they've understood the power of the narrative. So to take an example of a recent pay-per-view, you had Jorge Masvidal against Colby Covington. He's not Irish. Colby Covington. And these guys used to be roommates. They used to be best friends. They used to train together, live together. A few things happened. They fell out. And now they can't stand each other. And they really, really played on that to sell pay-per-view buys.
Because they did I never watched this, and tell me if you don't know anything about it, because I don't. But it was the Contender series, which seemed to be more of a drama type thing, because you see that old footage of McGregor winding up. Was it Chad Mendes and Uriah?
Isn't that
and all them?
That's the Ultimate Fighter. That's like a spin-off that they do. Like it was almost like a reality show.
Yeah,
and I'm not aware that the other promotions do other things like that, because there's a Tuesday night Contender series, which is kind of like, up and coming fighters coming up and literally fighting for a contract. These little tournaments for a contract, and then you've got the Ultimate Fighter, which is a televised season every year. It's kind of like Big Brother, but with MMA fighters, and the coaches of the two teams are fighters who then later on that year will fight each other. So they're sort of shoulder to shoulder every day, sort of coaching their guys to beat each other, and they're also giving each other a lot of shit in between because they know that they're going to fight each other, so they're trying to wind each other up. And so there's kind of these extra nuggets that build up the story, because you need to believe in the story. So often you need to have a good guy and a bad guy. I mean, it's
sad, isn't it, really? That's how it is. But
right, because otherwise it would just be two robots. Like with no personality. I need to care. I need to invest.
If you're into something, it should be because of the skill and the and all these type of things. But it just isn't, is it? It's they like Jorge Masvidal's a perfect example. Lost lots of fights, wasn't the best, but then he kind of got a bit of wind behind him. And later in his career, he's like the what do they say? Like the third biggest paid star. Last time he just signed a new contract and on a losing streak as well. He just lost 2 fights in a row, and then. He's still getting paid more than everyone else, and it's just not about the competition. I don't know. It's not. I don't know if it's a bad thing or not, but it's just funny, isn't it? How it's not about whether you're the best.
No, and it's interesting who gets the biggest fights, because, of course, your ranking does come into it. It's not going to be 35 in the world fighting for the championship. But oftentimes, guys that have a bigger personality or a bigger public following will leapfrog other guys that maybe don't speak as much or speak as clearly or create as much interest or as much hype. For a good example is Leon Edwards, the British welterweight. I mean, he's been at the top of the sport for many years. He's beaten everybody that he needs to beat, but the guy doesn't
sell the tickets.
I don't want to be rude to the guy. I'm sure he's. If I ever walk through Birmingham, I don't want to be punched in the face. But he doesn't ooze charisma, let's put it like that. He doesn't speak very clearly. He kind of mumbles. There's no interest there. Like there's no human connection for a lot of people. So although he's a great fighter, he's not going to sell as many pay-per-view buys, and it's a business at the end of the day. So and
they literally gave Colby and Masvidal 2 shots each before.
Right, and I think
Edwards got one, even though
I think Edwards will get the next one. And if you look at the numbers of the pay-per-views, which is the bottom line, because it's a business, and that's how they make their money from people paying to watch the event. I doubt it's going to be a huge seller, but not because he's not a great fighter. He is a great fighter, but people don't tune in just for the fight. They tune in for the personalities.
Is that something that the Klitschko brothers were accused of in boxing?
Yeah,
because they were technically super superior to most of their adversaries, but they were just not really creating any hype around the boxing matches.
Right,
very pragmatic.
What's your story? What's your identity?
Right.
Like, give me something about you, so I can, when I'm watching you fight, because probably most people that watch the UFC don't actually understand the technical details of what they're doing, but you want to believe in somebody and you want to be cheering for somebody.
Yeah, it's like with this Russian guy who was wrestling with the bears. I mean, there's a whole story built up. As a child, he was wrestling with the bears, and then he became this superior. What's his name again?
Khabib Nurmagomedov.
Exactly.
And then would he have been the star he was without his Conor McGregor beef? Most probably not. He'd have just been because he was a good, humble. He kind of had his lines, but really, I don't think without McGregor he wouldn't have been the star he was. He wasn't quite charismatic enough for all that, but he had that beef with McGregor, and then all his stuff, kind of his personality. Maybe they were good for one.
But it's like you said, exactly. This was like this kind of fight between two worlds, like somebody being humble and there was an interesting backstory to this guy, and then this other very extroverted, flamboyant character with a very big mouth. I think that actually got me a bit more into the UFC back then for a while. And it's like you guys said, it's like there's a story, there's an excitement behind the people and their stories, and so that actually is everything but the fight. And the fight then was the conclusion to the whole drama, to the whole soap opera there.
Yeah, exactly. But it's,
and what, like I say, one was interested in is everyone moans about the wrestling.
What do you mean everyone moans about the
I'm
wrestling?
sure you guys don't, because you're into your jiu-jitsu, but most people moan about it's almost like they want to see a stand-up fight, and when it goes to the floor, they find the fight boring. Would you say that's a common?
So you're saying that people like to watch the striking, and they complain when there's too much grappling.
Exactly. Yeah. That's true. Right? Would you agree?
I would agree, because if you don't do jiu-jitsu, it looks like two guys lying on each other half the time.
So what I wonder is how. I mean, maybe it's just a credit to the promotion. Why isn't? Because you could watch boxing, but boxing's quite restricted almost, isn't it? They do end up doing a lot of hugging. So you'd have thought that kickboxing or Muay Thai would, if someone promoted that well, it would lap UFC because it's more entertaining. But it doesn't really seem to be about that. It's more entertaining to the layman, should we say? Because, like you say, you guys are jiu-jitsu
but
guys.
you're right. There's something very universal about people punching each other in the face. No, seriously, it's something that everybody can understand. Like, I don't need to know the technicalities of your movement or how your fist's moving. I understand that when a fist is moving at velocity and it connects with somebody's skull, then there's going to be an effect, and I'm interested to know what that effect will be. Whereas you're right, the kicking as well. Then it's very explosive. It's very engaging to watch all these powerful movements. And it's about the marketing at the end of the day. How has it been marketed? It's not been marketed as well as the UFC, obviously.
And it's almost like, McGregor especially is always calling Khabib a crotch sniffer and all this, and he just clearly doesn't want to take it to the ground. But he doesn't, does he? Because he knows he'll lose. And you just think someone with his following and charisma why doesn't he just go and start a kickboxing league and it just get bigger, because that's what elbows, kick. Look, probably Muay Thai is the best thing, but call it something different. I don't know. But you'd have thought that would do better because it's more. People don't want to see it go to the floor. Generally, the layman, and then you could sell it to everyone. But I don't know why that doesn't happen. There must be a reason, or maybe it's just. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I don't know. It's I tell you what. I'm not sure this is even answering your question, but what was fascinating earlier, a few weeks ago, it was in January, Francis Ngannou, the heavyweight champion, is built like a superhero. He was a classic striker. Nobody knew that he had any other skills, right? He could just about defend the wrestling and get by. And he started wrestling, and it was incredible. It was incredible. Like, he was throwing this guy around. He started doing some jiu-jitsu. He was trying to get some submissions, and it was amazing to see how his skill set evolved. So,
how did it look in your sort of half experienced eye? Was it skilled jiu-jitsu, or was it trying to throw out some jiu-jitsu?
He knew what he was doing by the looks of it. Yeah, he wasn't. There are certain things that you need to know. The throw that he did. If you look up his throw, was unbelievable. The amount of force in it. But you're right.
I suppose it comes to I suppose with him it's you could probably get by a lot with when it comes to throwing with just the sheer manpower. Like you don't need to have as much skill as a smaller person. Yeah, sorry.
All right, guys. I think we are exactly.
Ding ding.
Ooh.
Time's up. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I'd check it out, especially if you are interested in any of the martial arts, but also just human movement and human communication. There's a lot of psychology that goes on before, during, and after the fights. There's a lot of ingredients that go into it. Even people that are interested in marketing, for example, have a look at how the UFC has built up this brand in the last 30 years.
It's incredible, yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of the fastest growing companies in the world, I think.
All right, UFC.
CUF later.
All right.
See you later, guys.
Ciao.
Peace.